How you doing? Hi.
How are you?
11 o'clock. Welcome. Let's go and do roll call.
Sorry. Chair Klein,
Here.
Member Robertson. Vice Chair.
Here.
All right. Member Adams. Absent. Member Harris. Absent. Member Kenny.
Here.
All right. Member Oliverio.
Here.
Member Connie.
Here.
Member Spitzer is absent. Member Van Houten.
Here.
All right. Very yellow form.
Okay. I'll just ask, does anybody have any time issues that I need to know about that you might have to leave early or step out or anything?
Nope.
Anticipate dinner.
Okay. All right, let's see what we do. Okay. Let's move into A2. Any public comment? Start with anything in the room. Seeing none, anything online?
Yes.
Okay.
Ms. Harris is here.
Member Harris just joined. Okay, Arthur, we'd like to hear from you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to speak to item B3, B4 on your agenda, Art Rangel, for the record. Before you spend tax increment money, you first have to generate it. The tax increment is about generating property tax. And the way to maximize it is to build as large a building as you possibly can with very high Florida area ratios, the way Boise and other sophisticated cities have done it. The more tax increment that can be generated within each of our two project areas, the more money we have to build our economy and leverage that money with the private sector to bring better jobs to our region. Using redevelopment agency tax increment to subsidize affordable housing is not typically economic development. Creating the right types of jobs through redevelopment is economic development. While funding capital improvements projects is important, it typically does not lead directly to immediate economic development. There are some good examples in Reno that have grown tax increment. One is the Reno Experience District, which is within Project Area 2. The red is a project which is expected to generate approximately $5.2 million in annual tax increment revenue by transforming the 55-acre vacant land into high Florida area ratio 5-story buildings of high-end residential apartments, hotel, retail, and office space. And the red still has 14 acres to develop. Another example is the Ballpark Apartments, which generated $848,000 in property taxes in 2025 as a 5-story, 369 unit apartment complex. Before the Ballpark Apartments were built, the property generated only $47,000 in 2023 as a vacant surface parking lot. However, the Ballpark Apartments would not generate the synergy that the red would generate because the Ballpark Apartments is only apartment use. The red, on the other hand, is a true mixed-use project which not only generates tax increment, but also room tax and sales tax. The only thing missing from the red are high-paying jobs to help fill their remaining luxury apartments. I encourage this body to recommend to the agency board to allocate the necessary redevelopment agency money to advance catalyst projects to attract high-end companies to our two project areas and rebuild Reno's economic development. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Arthur. Any other public comment online? Okay, seeing none, we'll move into A3, approval of the agenda. Couple things to mention. What might be good, because we have a full agenda, is to move B7, which is a presentation on survey findings, and C, the update from the DRP, to the next meeting. Does anybody have any issues with that? Okay, I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda with those movements.
So moved.
So moved by Member Harris. Can I get a second?
Nadia Oliverio, second.
Second by Member Olivero. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? None opposed. The agenda is approved for the day. We'll move into a couple of approval of the minutes, A4 and A5. Take these separately. So approval of the minutes for January 26th. This was the special meeting regarding the ACES agreement. I'll ask for a motion to approve these minutes. Motion. Are you waiting to what?
Oh.
Are you motioning?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was waving at the mayor, but yes, Nettie Oliverio, I move to approve.
Okay,
I'll second.
seconded by member Kenny. Any other discussion on these minutes? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say nay. Got you, Mike. Okay. Those minutes are approved. A5, the second round of minutes. These are from our regular meeting in February 2nd. I'll ask for a motion to approve these minutes.
Nettie Oliverio, move.
Okay, moved by Nettie. And do I have a second?
Second.
Second by member Harris. Any discussion on the minutes? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, minutes are approved. A6 chair report. I'll just mention again that we've been updating the city council or redevelopment agency. If anybody would like to join me in those updates, please feel free. Anybody's invited. So I'll just offer that out. Member Van Houten has come a couple times, but I'll just offer it to the board. I'll let you know when we go before the redevelopment agency to update them on the business we have before us. That's all I have. I'll move into A7 staff report.
No general announcements other than the next meeting is April 6th. I do know that it's Washington County spring break, but it is April 6th.
Okay.
No other announcements related to that.
So on that, is anybody going to be not in town for that? Mike won't be. You're here.
I'll be here.
Okay, I think we might have quorum.
All right.
Do you have any issues with that?
We'll make sure that we have coverage, Mr. Chair. If you'd like, we can do a quorum check before we post the agenda. So then we can ensure that you've got quorum. So then you're not waiting if that's helpful for you.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Anything else from staff? Any questions for staff? Okay, let's get into our business items. B1 redevelopment project updates.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brian McCardle for the record. So we did print out or include in your packet is sort of our report metrics that we're printing monthly based on events and activations that have occurred throughout the area over the past month. I think the most notable one is Western Lights, which I'll ask Rachel to comment on in a minute. We have our restore projects coming along. You should see Yuzu Sushi opening up here fairly soon. They got their certificate of occupancy and some other permits have come in. And then related to our TIP applications, we've had some requests from some developments to pause or hold on their analysis. The first one is Red's multifamily project. They asked us to hold. They're not prepared to move forward at the moment. They are still pursuing their retail expansion because they have two applications. So they're still proceeding with their retail. The Fifth and Keystone project, we've been asked to hold on that for potential property sale or restructuring of the project. And then the last one is the Bonanza Inn Jacobs Entertainment project. They plan to demolish the Bonanza Inn, so that would make that project no longer eligible. In general, for the redevelopment agency and staff, we are still conducting the parking gallery assessment. We should have a final to bring forward in front of this body in the next month, possibly next meeting, addressing operations of the parking gallery, improvements needed, how we plan to adjust for all the demand that gallery is going to have with the Reformer project coming online, the 118 West project, and then potential for the Truckee Lane building and Riverboat to come online. So that parking gallery is going to get a lot of demand once those things come online. So we'll make sure we're prepared for that. We are getting proposals from a relocation specialist related to the Reno Sparks Gospel Mission, which is part of AB 241. We have to have an agreement with them before we can allow them to take over the piece of land at the NAMS campus that was part of that deal. So we'll have that in the next month or two. Dan walked through some contractors for the Amtrak bathroom remodel or improvement. So that's coming along. We'll have likely bids and an ILA to bring back before this body next month. We have announced the district activation pilot program that you all saw last month that was approved to proceed. Over the next few weeks, districts and promoters will have an opportunity to apply for those funds for the next year all the way through June. The agency board did adopt the rebrand and name change to re-up. We are waiting the final brand packet from our partner Resonance before we announce official launch of the new rebrand. Dan did a great job. We had a ton of files and boxes that were in the vault downstairs, and Dan's been going through those and unearthed the treasure trove of old historical items. So behind Dan right there is a 3D model of the ballpark, Aces ballpark. There's other photos of how that was originally proposed, but we've also found a ton of documents on what the agency was up to in the late 90s, early 2000s, when they were dealing with the MAPE and the Riverwalk improvements, the site of the movie theater and parking gallery. They were quite active in the late 90s. So we hope to bring forward a summary of the history there. Last two things, we have 2 current positions open. We're hiring a development coordinator to work with a lot of interest from private development and identify some potential sites and start to work through the process of attracting developers to infill sites. And then we have a program assistant to help us with a lot of the programs we run, from Restore to Small Walls to the district activation pilot and others going forward. So that I'm going to turn it over to Rachel real quick. She did something this past month, past 2 weeks. If you didn't hear about it, Western Lights.
Hello, everybody. Rachel McIntyre, placemaking manager for the record. Just take a few minutes and give a quick overview on the 2nd annual Western Lights Festival that just took place February 19th through the 21st. This event was one of the catalyst events from the initial downtown activation pilot program that was launched in 2024 utilizing ARPA funds. We're really excited to share year 1, Western Lights had a reported 61,000 attendees. That did not include downtown residents, children, or anyone who has IP address tracking turned off on their cell phones. So we estimate, it was closer to probably about 75,000 in year 1. We're still waiting on the numbers for year 2, but preliminary numbers for year 2 show just over 50,000. And it takes until tomorrow, actually, is the day when we'll get our actual numbers. And year 2 had some unique challenges. Year 2, we had a snowstorm. So the team lost about 2.5 days of their build just hauling and removing snow. But some exciting statistics in year 2. We had just over 50 art installations compared to 36 in year 1. We brought in 82 live performances. Just over 70% of the art and musical performances that were highlighted in Western Lights in 2026 were local. So when we think about feeding back into our local creative economy, this event is definitely a catalyst event for that. The small business impact was another significant one. This year, the event served in helping to promote more than 42 small businesses in the Reno community. And that is separate from the arts organizations and artists that were supported. So from an economic impact, we'll be working on our impact report this month. Excited to share that with this body in April. But we'll come back with economic impact numbers and more data-driven analytics on the event. The group is already working on 2027 with some very exciting developments. They'll be partnering with the Portland Winter Lights Festival, as well as Napa Lighted Art Festival. All 3 happen regionally around the same time, which is why strategically this date has been chosen for Reno. It allows for us to route art. So it allows for us to get our Reno artists into those communities a little more seamlessly, and vice versa to route national, international works that are being shown in those cities to bring them here to Reno at a far more affordable rate, because transportation costs for large scale art can be expensive. Some other things that are going to be looked at for next year that the board is already working on is a partnership with Midtown District and expanding the event into Midtown. We did a small little taste of that this year by programming the after parties in the Brewery District. Had great success there. So we're excited next year to be expanding and making this more of a broader RDA-wide event that encompasses activation sites both in Midtown District, downtown, Riverwalk, and then also in the Brewery District.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you. Any questions? Or?
Any comments or questions on the event? Looking forward to the results, economic results. That'll be cool.
As well, last year, 2026 is about 2.1 million in estimated economic impact. So I'm excited to see how we grew that this year.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Fantastic.
I have nothing more.
Okay, any questions or anything for staff? Okay, we're updated on redevelopment. Let's move into B2, our first discussion item. This is a presentation on Kemper Crowell as outside legal counsel for the agency regarding the feasibility of expending agency funds for police.
Mr. Chair, Ashley Turney, Assistant City Manager for the record. I'd like to introduce Rory. Reference that while she's been in the private sector for a bit, she has extensive RDA roots in the public sector. She was for those of you who know Jonathan Shipman here at the City of Reno, she is the Jonathan for the City of Henderson. Was responsible for helping them set up some of their redevelopment districts, as well as dealing with an extension of one of their redevelopment areas. So she is very well versed in this area as it is specialized. So the RDA board gave direction to have outside counsel review and give a public opinion on the utilization of funding for police officers using RDA funds. So she is here today to go through her presentation and answer questions for you. I would like to note that this item will go before the redevelopment agency on March 25th for their review as well. It's part of why you are not stylized for action today. This is discussion only, so she can brief you.
Rory, thank you for that introduction. Again, my name is Rory Robinson, and I act as outside counsel through my firm Kemper Crowell for matters as provided to us by staff and is requested by the agency board. So we've been asked to address this issue of the feasibility of expending redevelopment agency funds for policing activities. Typically, our opinions would be confidential and attorney-client privileged, but with the level of interest and I think a little bit of the thorniness of this issue, we've been asked to provide a public opinion. So the first question is why policing? I think besides the fact that the board had asked us to look at this issue, I think a lot of people have a concept of redevelopment as dealing with blight, which is a specific area of concern under the redevelopment agency statutes. And there's a common understanding that the existence of blight, and this is directly from one of the findings of the legislature, the existence of blight in redevelopment areas cause a need for disproportionate expenditures for crime prevention, the preservation of public health and safety, and the maintaining of adequate police protection and other services and facilities. So there is an acknowledgement of some nexus between blighted areas, redevelopment, and the need for preservation of health and safety. Whereas the city of Reno has police powers directly when acting as city council, the city council of the city has certain powers, and those powers are pursuant to the charter and chapter 268, which deal expressly with police powers, the police department, the chief of police. The city of Reno's, the redevelopment agency's power comes specifically from statute, and that's the community redevelopment laws, chapter 279. And that's an important distinction, I think, because if you're accustomed to the idea of what are the powers of city council in performing the duties and powers of the city, it's a little bit different from what are the powers of the redevelopment agency board when seated as the redevelopment agency. So the powers of the redevelopment agency are limited to powers specifically set forth by statute. And additionally, there are certain powers that may be implied, although they're not expressly granted in the statute. And in this case, the applicable statute again is going to be chapter 279, when those powers are necessary to the agency's performance of its enumerated duties. So duties being its legal obligations under chapter 279 and its responsibilities under chapter 269. This same case, which is cited multiple times by the Nevada Supreme Court, with respect to different agencies, provides when the language of statute is plain and unambiguous, you give the statute its ordinary meaning. You don't go beyond it. So you can compare that to the powers of city council, the power of the city of Reno, under the chapter 268. The powers of the governing body there, and this is recently enacted. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the traditional Dillon's rule, which was the more limited common law, where the powers of city were limited to those expressly granted and necessary and applied. In this case, the Nevada legislature fairly recently, I think it was about 10 years ago, adopted, I think 10 or 12 years ago, adopted a provision specifically dealing with matters of local concern. And those matters of local concern have somewhat expanded powers of the city. There's a definition there, but that includes redevelopment. So there are overlapping powers of the city of Henderson when the city council is acting as a city council, and when the same members are seated as the governing body of the redevelopment agency. So the purpose of chapter 279, which is the community redevelopment law, and was to give additional powers that didn't previously exist under the old Dillon's law regime to a governing body. In this case, it would be the city council, who elected to adopt or form a redevelopment agency. So there are certain powers in that statute that are specifically enumerated purposes. They're set forth in various ways in the statute. It's been amended over time. So we necessarily have to parse through the different provisions, because again, the powers of the redevelopment agency in particular, and in expending redevelopment agency funds, are going to be those powers because they have a source of funds that's different from the city's funds generally, are going to be limited to those powers that are necessarily implied or expressly granted. So the community redevelopment law also provides for redevelopment plans for the redevelopment areas and permits the use of tax increment funds in certain instances. It's not. One second. Do I need to push this one? Oh, there we go. So we'll begin with the enumerated duties, powers, and purposes. There are various provisions in chapter 279 that set forth the purposes of the agency. And bear with me because I've included a lot of the language of the statute, because there's really no way around it other than parsing the statute and saying, okay, what are the express duties and what may be necessarily implied from these duties. So the highlighting there is just, if you look at it, there's a clear theme. To protect and promote sound development, redevelopment of blighted areas, provide for the general welfare, specifically by remedying these injurious conditions, reference to blighted areas. Blighted areas are defined by at least 4 of the following factors. When the redevelopment agency sets up redevelopment areas, they have to have an express finding that these factors, at least 4 of these factors, exist. So again, if we look through, I've highlighted some language, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it really goes to a property focused, a development, redevelopment, bricks and mortar overall picture for the activities of the redevelopment agency, the existence of buildings and structures, unfit and safe. So, and you'll see I highlighted crime because again, there's a mention of crime, but it says due to one of the following factors. And those factors are explicitly related to quick characteristics of real property improvements, sort of the physical condition of the redevelopment area. So they're not social factors, kind of social environmental factors. There's light, sanitation, open spaces, recreational area, your typical blight, deterioration, dilapidation. There is a reference to economic dislocation, deterioration, and disuse. Again, all of these kind of go toward what's constructed in the area, the condition of what's in the area, how is it currently being used. And some more factors, lack of proper utilization goes to the use, loss of population, environmental contamination. So redevelopment is defined as the planning, development, replanning, redesign, clearance, reconstruction, or rehabilitation of all or part of a redevelopment area, and the provision of structures and space. And again, I'm walking through these specific language because that's what you need to do to be able to find a nexus between what is the redevelopment agency's powers and how are you using those powers to further the purposes. So there may be a goal a couple steps removed that, you know, blight causes crime, perhaps increases in crime, but these are the tools that are specifically given to the agency, and the agency's purpose is related to blight. And then the city has the power specifically to deal through its police powers with the issue of the crime. So there, I just included declaration of state policy to show you there is a specific provision in there related to the provision of affordable housing. And this is specifically saying that the provision of affordable housing is permissible even if it's not in the plan. And sometimes that is telling in the sense of if there's something not specifically in the statute. This was an amendment. This wasn't adopted with the original 1959 declarations of state policy. If there's a desire to go back and do something beyond what was previously granted, or to cause the agency, to require the agency to do something additional, then there has been statutory amendments. So there are general powers in the redevelopment statute. There's the powers of the agency to sue and be sued, have a seal. There is the ability to obtain services. These general powers necessarily need to be interpreted in the wider context of what are the purposes of the agency and what are the more specific powers. There's a provision for the agency is able to hire its personnel and also to have access to city services. The city services specifically enumerated are planning commission and city engineer, but they're an opportunity to utilize other departments and offices. So the specific powers granted to the agency include the ability within the redevelopment area or for purposes of redevelopment. And we read the definition, or I read the definition of redevelopment earlier. Again, these are all very heavily focused on physical improvements. There is some reference to personal property, but this is, you know, acquiring real property and improvements, clearing building structures improvements, sell, lease, or exchange real property, and then to offer exercise those powers that are incident to the ownership of the real property. So as I mentioned earlier, there are redevelopment plans, just can be adopted pursuant to the community redevelopment law. And there's an express provision that allows for the adoption of those plans. Those are plans for the improvement, rehabilitation, and redevelopment of blighted areas. So this goes directly to what are the duties of the agency, specifically to undertake those activities with respect to blighted areas. And I highlighted you can disseminate redevelopment information. Again, if there's something that seems somewhat related to the powers. It's specifically set forth in the statute. There's also a provision to accept financial assistance or other assistance from the public or private source. There are provisions, I haven't copied them here, but the chapter contemplates that, particularly early on in the formation of the redevelopment agency, that the city may be providing funds to the agency. There isn't a, and I haven't gone into the different provisions related to those funds. Those funds are treated separately. So the City of Reno Redevelopment Agency has two separate plans, as you're aware. There's a downtown redevelopment plan and the area 2 redevelopment plan. Those plans largely echo the powers in the statute that make them very particular to the area that they are addressing. You're not going to be able to expand any powers of the redevelopment agency beyond what's in the statute within the plans, but the plans may constrain those powers. So if there's a particular proposal regarding the use of funds, we'll want to review the plans to make sure that they're consistent with those plans. But generally, they deal with the addressing economic and physical deterioration and blight. Tax increment funds, which is the source of the agency's funding, are addressed in provision or statute 279-676, and those are required to be paid into a special fund of the agency that's to pay the cost of redevelopment, and then it's also for principal and interest on bonds and other agency financing. There's a specific provision regarding owner participation agreements. I know that the agencies had owner participation agreements. These agreements have to be approved by the legislative body through particular findings. And there's a specific provision dealing with if the city were to make a loan, then the agency is able to pay the indebtedness of that loan with the tax increment funds. And again, some of these provisions I'm highlighting just to show that if there's a power that's expressly granted, then it's a power the agency has. Otherwise, it's not going to be a power of the agency unless it's necessary to the exercise of one of those expressly granted powers and duties. So that brings us back to the question of policing, and within the provisions that I've gone through, there aren't specific provisions dealing with providing for public safety, general policing activities. So we can look at a couple examples. Again, there's no specific provision to consider, nothing before the advisory board. So these are just examples that I use to try, for purposes of being able to talk about how the express powers and duties that we discussed may be interpreted in particular situations. So may the agency fund crime prevention through environmental design? And you can say, well, that's not really policing, and that's probably true, but I included this example because I think this is a clear case of how is a redevelopment agency to address these issues of public safety crime through those powers that it particularly has under the statute, through the enumerated powers and duties of the statute. This is something that would be within its power, and it can cooperate with the city to aid in public safety in this manner. So may the agency pay the policing costs resulting from an agency project? There could be particular circumstances where, in the same manner that if the agency were paying for the development of a building, the demolition of dilapidated buildings within the agency. There are certain services, certain needs that come with that development project. And if, there are, due to the agency's particular actions, the exercise of its powers, it's necessary to secure that site. If we have to, clear that site somehow, there are circumstances in which there could be some expenditure of funds, I believe, based on the nexus between the agency's expressly granted, the enumerated powers and duties, and the need to have these particular policing activities take place. But I think that would be a narrow circumstance, and again, there should be a nexus. It should be consistent with the overall plan. Finally, may the agency pay salaries of police officers not resulting from an agency project. And I don't believe that there is strong statutory authority for the agency to undertake those activities. While there are recitals within the statute that crime is of concern, the agency's powers, again, the agency shares responsibility for redevelopment activities or powers with respect to redevelopment activities with the city. The city has certain enumerated powers pursuant to its charter, pursuant to Chapter 268. The agency's powers are particularly geared toward redevelopment, rehabilitation, construction, demolition, those types of activities, the ancillary activities of, disseminating information, planning, and so anything to do with policing, I think would be an additional step removed. So at this time, there's no proposal that I'm aware of, but I would exercise great caution in any type of proposal involving directly funding the police, the city of Henderson police force. So, thank you. Do we have any questions?
Questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple questions, and I appreciate the memo. I thought that was very helpful. Your example too, where you talk about that there could be some situations. I understand the comment about obviously it can stand up its own police force, can't hire new officers, but there are maybe some circumstances, limited circumstances, if there's a nexus to a redevelopment project.
Yes, and I think the important thing in that interpretation is whereas the powers of city council, the powers under the modified Dillon's rule in Chapter 268 allow for more tangential powers. It's incident to. In this case, it's the operative word is going to be necessary. So necessary to the performing of these duties. But yeah, I think there are circumstances in which directly related to this particular project, this redevelopment project, if there's a need for those types of powers, and be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. It shouldn't be a significant amount of money. If you're spending 25% of your project on policing, that I would say be very cautious about. But if it's, hey, we need security for this project, developers in the area are providing security, for their project, it makes sense. It's part of, our development, it's part of our demolition, then in those limited circumstances, I think it could be appropriate.
So maybe if it's limited in scope or duration and
absolutely.
They make findings that they can tie it into something to do with their development.
Absolutely limited in duration. And I would, look again at the direct necessity, that necessity being caused by the redevelopment project that the agency is undertaking, as opposed to just the general conditions of life.
Yeah.
Jay Kenny, would an example be if, let's say, we're tearing down a resort building and we needed to close the streets down as the demo went down? That's a specific example of something we could use those funds for?
Yeah, I
Right.
believe that
Something like that.
That would be my interpretation, that would be very limited duration and not a large amount of the overall cost of the project. But something that I would look at it is if a private party were undertaking this redevelopment project, is this the kind of cost that they would incur? And since the redevelopment agency has access to city personnel, it may have another avenue to provide the function, but again, there's that need for there to be a showing of reasonably necessary.
Yeah, another example I was thinking of is let's say you have vandalism, that's an issue, and it's contributing to the blight or it's causing the blight. You could pay all day long to repaint a wall, but if the next day it gets vandalized again, it's kind of defeating the purpose. You're just spending money for no reason. So to me, there could be a nexus drawn where, yeah, in this circumstance, there's a need for enhanced services, and it's a contract with the city of Reno for some limited period of time. Hey, we're going to fix this up. Let's diminish the crime in this area for some specific period of time in order to support the redevelopment that's occurred. But again, it'd have to be kind of a case by case finding by the board to make that nexus is kind of
and I think you're on shakier ground the farther you get out from this is a particular action that the agency is undertaking, because another characteristic of Chapter 269 is these aren't perpetual agencies exercising perpetual powers. They're supposed to go in, they've got, 30 years maximum, except in the rare cases of extensions where they need to make an impact and, affect those underlying conditions of blight as related to property. Whereas these ongoing, just social, economic type issues are, just by the statutory scheme, those are better addressed through Chapter 268 and in the powers of the city.
Any other questions?
Mike Van Houten for the record. So even if like Virginia Street qualifies as economic dislocation and blighted buildings and thus causes an increase of crime in that specific block, that's not really enough of a, is that enough of a connection to warrant that? And also the police department would still have the ability to pull those officers to other parts of the city, correct? Because I remember that was kind of an issue when downtown had some dedicated police officers. There is nothing really stopping them from being pulled into other parts of the city when there was items where they were needed.
Right. And again, there's that idea of there are certain goals of the redevelopment agency and, eliminating crime, eliminating graffiti may be part of the overall goals. But because they're an agency with limited powers, it should be tied to their actual exercise of the expressly granted powers, as opposed to, because that's kind of two steps removed. They've got expressly granted powers. Those powers are to address blight, and blight is defined in the statute, again, where those conditions directly related to real property and the condition of real property. So, we're getting farther away, and I think the farther away you get, the less statutory support there is, and the more caution should be exercised.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And Paul, the mayor has a question, I believe.
Rory, right?
Yes.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much. For the record, Hillary Sheedy, and I don't know if this has to be under public comment. Want to make sure. Yes, Ashley?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask my
Going into
question.
public
and then-
comment?
yeah, let me ask mine and then we'll
Yeah,
go to
go ahead.
public. Okay. Paul Klein. So as you know, the RDA is, from my opinion, is looking at possibilities, right? So not necessarily just going down one policy agenda, but what are the options to potentially consider a policy? So one thing that may be asked of you when you take this up to the RDA is how are cities like Las Vegas, which is under the same NRS as we are, ability to tie public safety enhancements to their RDA funds? They're doing it. Some other cities are doing it. The Brookings Institute has done studies on how to do this type of stuff. as long as in the planning, you're creating this nexus between blight and social conditions, right? So I don't know if you want to comment on that or just make a mental note that they may ask you, how are other cities able to do this under the same code?
Sure, and I have looked at, the agenda items. I don't know how the city of Las Vegas is specifically addressing it. If it's kind of, a small aspect of a larger program, which is what, I've discussed as being an option. I'm not aware of any specific grant going to fund, the police department. There is the ability of the city to grant funds to the redevelopment agency under the statute. I didn't discuss that here because it's just not, the climate we're in, where the city's in a position to grant funds. And then the question would be, why are you spending, granting city funds to the RDA to perform what's not their core function when that's part of the city core function? But it could be something like a revolving fund where the city is providing some funds. There's still a really limited ability to use them, the revolving fund for those purposes, but it may be somewhat broader. The language is a little more akin to the powers of the city council in exercising those. I'm just not aware of that program. We looked at, recent, probably the last 3 years or so. So if you're aware, and ask if anyone, wants to send information, I can take a look at it. Just, to be able to answer those types of questions, although it wouldn't be opining on, the appropriateness of, the city of Las Vegas with what they're doing.
Of course.
What would be the consequence? Let's say that RDA funded money to the city in a way that was not authorized by statute. What's the result? Would the city just have to repay the RDA?
Sure. There is a public integrity version, or department within the Attorney General's office. I'm not aware of the specific issue being looked at, but there are different avenues, ethics. It's because it is a use of public funds, but you probably depends on a lot of different factors how it's used. There's another, I'm blanking on the name of it, on a specific budgeting statute with respect to misuse of funds. You can, one of the kind of real world consequences is that you can get is, the next time the legislature meets, there may be things that are not particularly beneficial to the redevelopment agency. And a lot of times that's how these types of issues might be addressed. So it's better to, in this case, it's better to ask permission than forgiveness. If you're going to have the legislature weigh in and you want, some type of clarification, some type of expansion, looking at a legislative solution, there is the ability to request an attorney general opinion. I think in order to make it worthwhile, there should be really specific facts. Otherwise, they're probably, you may get a really general response back. And I don't know, how long those particularly take, but there is a statutory provision that allows the city attorney to request provision or an opinion for interpretation of the NRS.
Any other questions from the board? Yeah, I'll move into public comment. I don't know.
You guys want to go first? No? Okay, Roy, curious. Tell me what your understanding of the question was to opine on.
My question, and I watched the board, it was the feasibility of using redevelopment agency funds for policing. And that was the term that was used. So I've looked at it both in terms of, there's no specific proposal. I've looked at it in terms of paying police salaries directly, hiring police officers directly, reimbursing the city for the costs of, specifically related to policing, as I discussed, in connection with a redevelopment agency project. there isn't, there's additional patrols versus, hiring individual officers. That's how I interpreted the question.
Okay. Because I'm just curious, because specifically for the RDA, I think Mike makes a really good point. I know many cities, and I'm gonna send them to you. They do it, based on projects, events, things of that nature. So it is absolutely tight. Las Vegas does have a redevelopment, public safety program and policy. I think it's one that we should absolutely look at. So it's defined, and then it's very specific and it's clear to get to where we want to go. The other thing, cities have used that money for a police substation, things of that nature. Not a bad idea to have some sort of presence in a place where it's absolutely very visible. But I was just curious because I think there are ways to get there. There's also a lot of improvements they can put in place, whether it's cameras, those kinds of things to help prevent crime. But I think, we have to get another opinion in some capacity. I think this board wants to be extremely aggressive. I know the council does. So when we're asking for these opinions, I want to make sure that we're using every leverage possible, especially, as I'm sure it's been very challenging down here. And because of the amount of vacancies and it's dark, those types of things, it does tie into crime. And so we have to be really aware that businesses don't want to be downtown if their perception is crime. And so how does the RDA accomplish that the best way possible? But anyway, I wanted to clarify for you what my ask was, because I do believe there's a way to get public safety and a capacity there in the ways. I think, again, Mike brings up a really, really good point. And that could be because that, side of the street is incredibly dark. That could be because there is a certain home there with bad actors. Who knows? There's a lot of things that contribute to that. They also use it to expand on ambassador programs, but they work alongside with the police department in that capacity. So instead of saying why we can't, I want to figure out why we can and how we do. So that's where I'm coming from.
Any comments or any other comments?
I've got some other just general comments, not necessarily questions, but I think this is really, there's two issues here. One, can you do it legally? And then two, should you? And the second's really a policy question. On the legal side, I kind of agree with the memo to the extent that I think you can do it in very limited circumstances. Where you're contracting for services, kind of like the additional services or enhanced services like the SAD did years ago. But you got to make those findings, right? You got to make the nexus tying it into blight. Police substations, another good example. So I think there are some circumstances that you could do it in. They're limited. You're not talking about hiring officers or setting up your own police force. It's limited scope, limited duration. You got to make those findings how you're tying it into the blight in the area, but I think it could be done. So for me, the more difficult question is, should you? And that's the policy question that, at least when I'm sitting on this board, I don't have the direction in terms of, one, always a concern about using RDA funds to shore up general fund obligations. Slippery slope there. You got to be very cautious about that.
Agreed.
But two, it's also where the priorities from the redevelopment side. You've got limited dollars. Maybe this is a priority. Maybe capital improvements are a priority. That's one where I don't feel like I've got the direction on where you want to prioritize your dollars or how much you'd want to put towards any effort like this. So that's something that my comment would just be that the agency and the council really have to think about that from a policy perspective. In terms of you got limited dollars, where do you want to prioritize and what's the most important thing? And then if this is something you want to pursue, can you make that nexus? There's no question in my mind that downtown especially is woefully needing additional police services and it has for a long time. And I think that's contributing partly to the condition down there, the disincentive to redevelop, or at least it's impeding some redevelopment, or it's not allowing the redevelopment that's occurred to really blossom like it should. I don't know that this is the answer. It may be in some part, but that's kind of a policy question for you guys. But like I said, the two parts of the question, I think you can do it in very limited circumstances, but whether you want to do it's going to be up to the council and the board.
Yeah, echoed. I think it's more or less is just looking at all options on the table, and then the discussion can be had. Do we want to take this option? Knowing that it would take resources from other things. It's just necessarily having the attitude of, is it possible? Do we want it? As opposed to just not examining the question. I think we need to be responsible to the constituent to at least seek the possibility.
My other question would be too, what happens, let's just, if you were to use it for hiring or whatnot, these funds are only good for so many years, and then
Right.
where would the money come from?
Right.
Good point. Well, my comment on that one is I don't think funds could be used to hire an officer. I think it's an enhanced service. And if
Contract.
we had some of this issues with the SAD, if the police get called off to another district to do something, then I don't think the RDA should be paying for that time. Like if they were to pay, they're paying for a body on the ground in downtown as an enhanced service to what they're already providing as their base level, tied to a specific area or a specific region, but it's not just a subsidy for the general fund.
Yeah.
Or an opportunity for them to hire additional officers.
Something extra, right?
Yeah.
You have your standard workforce working and nothing is diverted from that. But then also there's this other group that's there on top of them, layered on top of them.
Exactly. Like council's point of, I'm going to hire an officer to stand guard to a project that's under construction.
Exactly.
Same thing. I'm paying for a specific service in a specific area.
And I'm not talking about ongoing, I'm talking about like what we saw in Midtown, once the lights came on, once the doors opened. There are a lot of people down there, and that sort of helps the perception and the safety issues, those types of things. But there's absolutely, programs with lighting and cameras, and brings up a really good point. Because it's very limited funding, but the other thing is the perception, right? But I think we're gonna have to lean into it some happening.
And I'll add one more. I don't think it's a substitute for making those difficult budgetary decisions you have to
Right.
make at the city level.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, so I
just-
hope that was not portrayed that way in any way.
No, it's just my comment generally for the world.
From the feedback that we get, you heard that survey, that was less than kind about downtown. And so people need to feel like there is a presence there in some capacity, whether that is a business, whether that is people outside at a parklet, whether that is an event, right? Ashley knows I'm looking at her. She's throwing all these things out there.
Write them down.
And so I do think tying it to a specific time, project, those kinds of things. I think something like that is very warranted, but it's not something that is, that should be looked at as a long-term tool. I get it.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate the experience with the SAD and even the bid to a degree where it was, hey, we want additional patrols Thursday through Sunday.
Yeah.
Put teeth in it if you're gonna do it and make sure you're getting what you're paying for. And then if you're not getting what you're paying for, you're not paying it, if you choose to go down this road.
In that vein too, just one last comment with regards to that, is that if we did decide to use funds in some way, if there isn't additional hires, does the force even have capacity to do that? And so that if we are allocating funds to that to make sure that there is actual capacity without hiring new, if that money isn't coming from us. So I would just put that on the table.
Point.
And just for clarification, I probably blew through my example one a little too quickly, but by environmental design, I think that would encompass. And that was the clear green light as far as, core agency powers would be things like addressing lighting and, alleyways and maybe, being able to block alleys, anything preventing or redeveloping areas in which there's loitering, the ideas of parks and, you know, brightly lit parks as opposed to, all of those are, in my view, clear green light if that would be the desire. Again, as long as it's consistent with the plan, and I haven't, you know, looked specifically at any particular proposal with respect to the plan. But that is within the core function, you know, going in, redesigning, planning, developing, all of those are enumerated powers.
Mike Van Houten, for the record, I just saw that Member Robinson had his hand up in case he wanted to say something.
Oh, yes. Vice Chair Robinson, do you have a comment?
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. I guess I just wanted to echo much of what Member Panya was saying, and my concern is that there just appears to be, in the language that in this memo, there appears to be very narrow circumstances under which the policing funding of policing would be possible. But I also am kind of wondering about the sort of parallelism. There's clearly a great need for the policing. I understand that 100%. But what is to prevent other services or functions of the city as an entity from being ascribed to the agency? And, you know, where does that line get drawn? And I think that I just understand the Kemper Kroll memo as being a very, very narrow and very cautious approach to that.
Okay, I'll just add to, just for staff, really, this has been a fantastic discussion. I think the RDA will find a lot of value in it. I would just also, you may potentially could get asked, or this information might be good to know for us as well, has the perception of social conditions, blight, crime, whatever it may be, prevented revitalization, redevelopment projects, investment in downtown? Have there been potential applicants for TIF or otherwise walked from a deal because of that perception that's kept us from all the options on the table? Anything else?
Should I?
Yeah.
I won't, but that should tell you my answer.
Okay. Anything else?
So nice, well, thank you. I'm like, I'm just gonna tell you how it is, Paul.
Anything else online? Okay. Thank you so much, and staff, for digging into this, and very interesting.
Really well presented.
Thank you.
Okay, let's close that item and then move into B3, which is redevelopment agency operating budget recommendations to the agency board for fiscal year 27.
Thank you, Mr. From a public comment?
Yeah.
We have one public
okay.
comment from the last item.
Who might that be?
It's Alicia Bauer.
Alicia, are you hoping to comment on this last item regarding public safety? Can you hear us, Alicia? You're on mute.
Yep, here I am. No, actually on B3.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. Well, let's hear the presentation, and then we'll open it up for commentary afterwards.
Great.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Brian McCardle. For the record, before you is the agency budget for the fiscal year 2027. We can pull up a document which is included in the staff report. I apologize if it's a little small. Just going through the revenue side, RDA 1 and 2 does capture most of its revenue from tax increment that is received above the base for those areas. For RDA 1, the expected tax increment for next fiscal year is $5 million. $253,000. The increment expected from the RDA 2 area is $11,199,000. I'll add that we do receive some parking revenues from the parking gallery. And then we earn a motor vehicle privilege tax in RDA 1, and we earn interest on our accounts. And so if you look at it from the revenue side, the RDA will generate or have about 18 million in change for next fiscal year to expend. Agency overhead, we can go through that. Not too dissimilar from previous years. We do have some debt related to the remaining bonds in RDA 1. This will be the last year of debt service before those bonds are paid off. RDA 2 has small debt due to the Cabela's bonds. It's about $50,000 a year. That will go through the end of life in RDA 2. And we have some contractual obligations. Obviously, the baseball deal comes out of RDA 2 until RDA 2 sunsets, and then that $1 million comes out of RDA 1. And then there is when RDA 1 was renewed, there's a contractual set aside of 18%. If the agency is paying off its debt and there are additional revenues, the Washington County School District has a set aside for 18% of those funds. So we will set aside $427,000 for the Washington County School District. We hold those funds for them. They have to propose improvements and projects within the RDA before we can release those funds to them. So if you look at the expenses, comes in at about $11,500,000, far below what the revenue is coming in at. And the delta there is proposed capital improvements and other projects that we want to take on. I will say that after you pay off the debt, RDA 1 does not have much funding. It's about $200,000 left over to do any projects. And so if you go to the next summary, that is why staff is proposing, presenting to you that we pull some money up from the reserve funds. Now that we're ahead of the debt in RDA 1, there's about $4 million in the reserve. It's proposed that we pull up $2 million. So you add the $200,000 we have left over plus the $2 million, that gives us a rough budget of $2 million to do improvements in RDA 1. RDA 2 has a substantial amount, $22 million. We're proposing pulling $4 million out to do additional projects. I'll mention that how we came up with the threshold of how much can be pulled up is it's stated here that we want to leave about 18 months of agency overhead in these budgets. Due to Nevada's property tax increment can be highly volatile. So we want to make sure that we have enough funds set aside for agency operations. And then commitments for future TIF payments, contractual obligations, things like that. And then our debt service. So if you look at those, we have about $3 million in 1 and $14 million in 2 that can be freed up. And we're proposing pulling $2 million from 1, $4 million from 2. Would anyone else like me to go into other aspects of the budget there?
Now, quick question. How did you build up the reserves? Is that something you're required for the bonds to hold, or is it just unspent monies?
No, we do have a bond reserve commitment. And so in the past years, I think we need to reserve 1 year of bond payment in the reserve fund. So in previous years, there just wasn't much there.
Okay. And then the school district one's interesting. Do they have any property in RDA 1?
And one.
They do in 1, Innovations High School, yes. And they have the parking lot across the street. So yes, they do have property.
Is that by statute or contract?
Statute.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mike Van Houten, for the record, I have just a couple of staff questions. Are all of the 80 RDA staff paid out of the salary and wages under agency overhead, and the 2 new positions that you're looking at filling, would those also change this budget at all, or is that already included under the salaries and wages line item under agency overhead?
Ashley Turney, Assistant City Manager, for the record. All agency staff are currently paid out of that overhead. That includes those 2 vacant positions. Those were budgeted with this current year budget that we brought before you. So those are existing positions. They're all in on those numbers. And we're not actually requesting any new positions for this next FY. We've made the commitment to run the agency very, very lean for as long as we can. So we're committed to running the agency at less than 20% of the revenue is the commitment that I've made to the board publicly. And we're currently running it at a lower rate than that. We're at about 16.7% of overhead currently.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any questions?
There are questions on the specific programs. We're happy to go over those with you as well. They were included in your packet. What we're proposing this year are the same programs that you budgeted this current FY. Some of them just have an expansion with more funding, but we are not proposing much new. The only thing to note is Love Your Block is a Bluebird program that is run through our housing division. They've mentioned that if we have some available RDA funds, they could do matching programs in order to enhance that. So that is the only new programmatic item that you'll see in the budget. That's 25,000 for RDA 1 and 100,000 in RDA 2. That would just be a pass through for them to be able to expend, and it would be used in redevelopment areas specifically.
For improvements.
For physical improvements. You might have seen some of those in Ward 3 last year. There was a coffee shop improvement. There's been some landscaping improvements. So those are some of the recommendations.
Any other comments or questions?
Mike Van Houten, for the record, what's the vacant to vibrant retail attraction program? You might have already gone over that, but just refresh me a little bit.
We have not, Brian McCardle for the record. We have not. That will come up. We did put some retail attraction funds in this year's budget. We will bring an item next month highlighting how we plan to extend those funds. And then what we're asking here is to continue that program into next fiscal year. I mentioned Vacant to Vibrant is not the name of any program. We stole that from San Francisco. That is the name of their program. But we would like to do something similar in that vein where we work with specific retail spaces, improve them, and get them ready for retailers to move in to reduce vacancy.
So there'll be an item that will come before this board, as Brian mentioned, next month for your recommendation for us to take to the RDA with different best practices from across the country. You'll see that represented as options from giving brokers incentives, hiring a headhunter to fill space, or some agencies across the country actually lease space themselves and then sublet to other small businesses in order to help get them in the door. There's a multitude of options that we see across agencies. And so we'll be bringing forward that research to this body for your recommendation before we take it up to the RDA board.
So because our next item, we get into CIP, you guys have established that for the budget, for the CIP projects, that 2 million out of RDA 1, 2 million RDA 2 dictates the budget in the next item, correct?
That's our current recommendation is 2 million from reserves and then 4 million from reserves in RDA 2. So that will give you 2 million in RDA 1 and roughly 10.5 to 11 million in RDA 2.
Okay.
That's the
supplement.
current. Yes, it's to supplement. The next item will go into more detail, but there are nearly $300 million in known CIP needs. So lots more month than money, as the case may be. So that's why we are recommending to supplement it in order to try to kickstart some of these programs. As you know, this body, you made a recommendation to the RDA and we funded the Amtrak bathrooms, as Brian mentioned in his staff update. As Dan did the walkthrough today, that's going out for bid. That is the first redevelopment capital improvement project that the agency has done in 17 years, 15 years. So we're trying to stimulate that.
Mr. Chair, given kind of the relationship between B3 and B4, should we open up B4 and kind of discuss them together before?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Let's go to public comment and hear Ms. Barber and others that want to comment on. Actually, we'll open up B4 as well. So if comments can come to either of those subjects, are welcome. So Ms. Barber, please feel free to comment.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. I was thinking I would probably switch it over to B4, so this is perfect. Well, thanks. My name's Alicia Barber. I'm a historian and a writer. an educator here in Reno. I think I know most of you. I sent all of you on the board an email this morning with a link to my e-newsletter called the Barber Brief. And I've been thinking about redevelopment and historic preservation a lot lately. And I actually wrote about it last week too, but I just learned this morning that I could contact all of you directly. So, but I invite you to check out the last edition on my Substack site. I served on the Historical Resources Commission from about the time I moved here in 2003 for well over a decade. And I've worked really closely with the city of Reno on a number of projects for, I mean, really about 2 decades now. And I wrote a whole book about Reno's development, especially its downtown. So my primary interest in why I wanted to just speak to you is helping you make sure you have the context and the information that you need to make decisions that touch upon historic properties. Anything like the Restore program, but a lot of the programs and activities that you work on, since historic preservation is such an important part of planning for the built environment, and particularly in Redevelopment Area 1, which includes the oldest part of Reno. So I would just love to be an ongoing resource for you. I want you to feel free to contact me along with your city staff, when you have questions about historical issues. Not everything that the RDA touches on related to historic properties is in the purview of the Historical Resources Commission, so I might have some knowledge that they don't. When it comes specifically to the capital improvement projects, I really appreciate the recommendation of funding for the historic depot. And I just want to make sure, as I wrote about, that you're aware of all the work we put toward the plan to convert that building into a heritage center, beginning back in 2011. And the improvements that are recommended for the depot in your rankings would, I think, be necessary regardless of the specific outcome for that building. But I'd be happy to give you a full report on that heritage center plan, which doesn't preclude commercial and cafe. In addition to it, to the historical aspects, I referred to the Basin Street Station in New Orleans in my brief, which is very bustling, dynamic. It can show you what that might look like. And then just lastly, just to wrap up here, of course, I'm concerned about the Lear Theater, which didn't make the staff recommendations for RDA funding. We're still supposed to have a city council discussion about the Lear following the very successful community meeting we held in January. And I was hoping that would have happened sooner because we'd very much like to try to have some RDA funds dedicated toward that. I know funds are scarce in RDA 1. I wish the sequencing were better here, but I'm hoping that your recommendations today won't preclude dedicating some funds, even a small portion, toward the Lear. That would just be so helpful. We really want to make sure we have that building sealed up before next winter. So thanks very much. Please let me know if I can be of any assistance, and I appreciate talking to you today. Thanks for all your hard work.
Thank you. Any other comments?
One online for Arthur.
Arthur, please feel free to comment.
I will. Thank you so much. I appreciate what Alicia had said, and I really agree with everything. My concern is this: having had extensive redevelopment experience as a staff member and consultant, we only have 8 years left in Project Area 2 and 17 years in Project Area 1. And the amount of money that the agency currently has is really extremely little as it relates to redevelopment, which is why I made my comment initially that really, in my opinion, generating as much income tax increment as you possibly can is really important. And like I also said, and I think the public improvements or the CPI things are important too, but I really think the agency needs to really concentrate on bringing in new economic development opportunities here. We have the region in which we can do that. There's a lot of opportunities out there with what's going on in California, people wanting to move out. I think we have a lot of opportunities here to attract good, high-paying jobs that are going to build, Class A office buildings in downtown to make it vibrant, things of that nature. And I really encourage this board to talk to the agency board about doing exactly that. Put your resources where they really, really matter. And that is, like I say, the true catalyst projects, the things that are really going to make a difference in the long term. We don't have that much time left. That's just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay, would it be okay if we moved into the CIP presentation and then we can come back and for possible action on these 2 items?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brian McCardle again. So I'm gonna give a brief presentation on the items proposed in the capital improvement plan. Just for reference, this is a photo from the Truckee River Vision Plan of Believe Plaza. Great. So as we put together the capital improvement plan, we just want to note that, or explain the process, is that everything that you're seeing today, all the final scored projects have been either, all right, I lost where I'm at. Got it. So we've gone ahead and synthesized most of the plan studies, sought input from agency board members, those other agencies throughout the community. And based on the budget that we have, there are some items that are proposed in front of you today. As mentioned, with the approval of the actual budget, we expect to have roughly $2 million for RDA 1 and $10 million to be expended in RDA 2. We identified order of operations. So first, we met with each agency board member to solicit ideas that they may have for improvements within both areas. We reached out to partner agencies, invited them to submit ideas that they may have or potential matching projects that they may have in their own capital improvement plans. We sought input from city departments, from parks. What is in your 5 to 10 year plan that you would like slated for potential RDA involvement? And really the bulk of the projects proposed came out of all the plans and studies that have been done to date that also received massive amounts of public improvement, public engagement, from the Downtown Action Plan to the Truckee Vision Plan and the Virginia Street Placemaking Plan. Each one of those took probably over a year and had multiple points of contact with the public. So as we put this together, we didn't go out for the public's input again, mainly because most of these plans already did so much engagement. Just to quickly reference some of the projects in these past studies, I apologize, the pictures are a bit blurry, but if you look at the Virginia Street Placemaking Study, phase 1 recommended that the agency focus on Locomotion Plaza, improving that so it can be used, and then doing a facade improvement program. And happy to say with the gift of ARPA funding, we were able to do both of those things. Phase 2 recommended that you start looking at streetscape improvements, not only micromobility lanes, but looking at the entire streetscape and furnishing package. And then also to start the process of designing what the future of Believe Plaza could look like. That has not been started. And then phase 3 was to complete the improvements to Believe Plaza and then also do a project called Maker Row, which was shipping containers on the county courthouse lot for bike shops or maybe like a pop-up bookstore. Going to the Truckee River Vision Plan, the Vision Plan really focused on river path, parks, and plazas. So in the upper right, you have the proposed rendering of what West Street Plaza could look like. With ARPA funds, we did some temporary improvements to West Street Plaza, but in the plan, it recommended to completely redo the entire plaza. And then the bottom one is Big Studios rendering of what Believe Plaza could look like with high traction turf, additional river improvements, a lot more shade, and reorienting some of the sculptures that are currently on Believe Plaza. The other item to come out of that study was the river paths. There are 4 character areas in that plan. Each one had its own suggested river path design, whether it's in the rural areas, dense downtown, but mainly going east from Lake Street. Is the first one was to do a cantilever path. Fortunately, we don't have to do a cantilever path with an agreement with the museum. We're going to move their fence back a little, but it recommended redoing the river fronts and the river paths. All the way to the Spark City line, all the way to the California border. Public art was recommended, as well as a lot of improvements to in-river features, removing unsafe conditions like rebar, concrete, and low-head dams. It recommended a blue-way plan. So if you're tubing in the river, it could actually be like wayfinding signage that says, get out here, or this is coming up on your right. And it mentioned a lot of removing aggressive vegetation, invasive species, that's the word I was looking for. And the last one I'll mention is there was a Barbara Bennett Wingfield Park master plan design that included a concept for a new amphitheater. I'll mention that through our history and everything else, we found that the RDA paid for the original amphitheater in Wingfield Park in I think 87 or 89. And it's not really built and raked to host events, so it would require some re-landscaping of the site. There was a pedestrian bridge recommended from the east side of Wingfield over to Barbara Bennett, and a lot of soft features on the Barbara Bennett side. If you notice, if you're in Wingfield Park, a lot of families use those boulders to get down to the river, but on the Barbara Bennett side, it's a retaining wall, and so it's very difficult. And so part of those improvements extended that soft buffer of park space. It also recommended a surfway, which we currently don't have in a diet park. So as we went through and solicited all these plans, we had 102 submissions from agencies, partners, city departments, and those plans. $300 million in requested projects. We took out some that weren't really projects. Some of them were like design standards. Some of them was that Blue Wave plan. And so if you took some of those out, there was 143 million requested for RDA 1 and $104 million requested for RDA 2. If you look at the top of the list for RDA 1, first one that bubbled to the top was Virginia Street sidewalk improvements. If you did that from the river all the way to the freeway, it'd be about a $20 million project. Even to go out and to start designing that, typically design, if I'm looking at Dan, it's about 10% of the overall project cost. Even designing the entire streetscape would be about $2 million, which is the entire budget for RDA 1. The event center and bowling stadium exterior lighting, it was noted in the $2 surcharge committee that this is one of the darkest corners in downtown. And so they actually proposed making some improvements to that intersection. They're limited in budget in that $2 surcharge. But we will mention that new information is the RCBA has budgeted $400,000 to do this. And so if this was approved today, the requirement from RDA would be half that. So it'd be sort of a match, 50-50 match. So that item would come down to about 400,000. Next one is a whitewater pullout location. So if you go down to Believe Plaza where you enter into the river, there's a few big boulders. What we notice is as tubers go down the river, it's very hard to get out of the river near the kayak park, even though people try it. As you get down here, the water widens and it gets a little mellow, but there isn't an easy way to just get off and get onto the concrete pad and get into the park. So Parks has recommended a small improvement just to move the boulders around to give a pull-out area. Most of the plans we've done mention shade on Believe Plaza, either permanent or temporary. That was one that bubbled to the top. Another one that was even brought up in the downtown action plan is to add shade to the biggest little dog park. Artificial turf gets very hot, so I think the dogs are having a hard time with the heat over there. Next to last is the historic rail depots. Depot improvements. This would be phase 2, continuing on what we've already started over there. This would be necessary improvements just to bring the building up to where we could even entertain a new use. That's HVAC, electrical, plumbing. And then last is downtown wayfinding signage. So we have about $2 million budgeted, but we have $22 million in requests. And so we're currently over $20 million in the budget. We can discuss that after the presentation. If you look at RDA 2, the ones that are crossed out, I just want to note, these are ones that are likely to occur in future years. So there's, it's unlikely that we would be able to even address phase 2 and phase 3 construction this fiscal year. So we took those off because those could be done next year. However, if you wanted to, you all could recommend that we increase the draw from reserves and start those projects now if you want to. But first one that bubbled to the top was University Village pedestrian improvements. This is in it, new sidewalks, but in addition to that, doing all the electrical and infrastructure needs to do new light poles and do all the infrastructure. So these are 2 items combined into one. Next up is starting on the river path construction, phase 1. This is already almost at 90% design. This could be started in the fall. This is almost a shovel-ready project, and we estimate it'll be about $6 million. With that, we can start on phase two. So proposal here is to start phase two design, and then in next year do the actual construction. Parks requested play elements at Broadhead and John Champion Park. So as we continue to make improvements on the pathway, improving those parks going that direction. I'll note I-80 landscaping improvements was one that NDOT had proposed. They have thought about this in their long-term planning, is redoing all the landscaping from Keystone to Sutro, kind of in that University Gateway district. As people come through town and see that section, it is primarily within RDA 2. And the last is East 4th Street bistro lighting from Lake to Valley. This is a request from the Brewery District. The infrastructure is mostly there, so we've already looked into that. The cost to do this would be the per pole improvements and then also repouring the concrete footing so that they can be load bearing enough to handle the weight of the bistro lights. With that, we pretty much balances out that RDA 2 funding. So with that, there is a motion from the RAB, but we can discuss both items before you all proceed, since we have both items open.
Okay.
I could mention, Mr. Chair, Ashley Attorney Assistant City Manager for the record. One thing just to note about the scoring committee was comprised of multiple different city departments based off their level of expertise. Someone from finance to make sure we can afford it, someone from maintenance and operations to ensure what the maintenance costs will be afterwards. That's one component, as you're aware. Redevelopment funds cannot be used for maintenance, so we do the capital project and then give it to the city to maintain. Staff from development services to understand permitting and planning, as well as city manager staff, redevelopment staff, and then the Downtown Reno Partnership, since they represent so many downtown businesses and property owners as well. There's a scoring matrix that's included in your packet. This was set up very similarly to how the city does their CIP process, as well as their CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, similar process. As always, all projects are listed in your packet, and you as the advisory board have the ability to move things up or down as you see fit. And then we will take that recommendation to the board on Wednesday, just to cover all your bases.
Nettie Oliverio for the record. Just to bring up the question. We know that our city needs some repair, infrastructure repair here and there, and have in all these eyes looking at things, have eyes also thought about what infrastructure needs is in the greatest need, and then what of these projects can benefit, save a little bit of money by being done at the same time that the infrastructure repair is done.
I think as it relates to, I'll use the Virginia Street sidewalk improvements as an example. And so why you see such a staggeringly large number on that is that's not just the sidewalk. That is streetscape and new trees and silvacells and irrigation and new lighting, new power, new infrastructure. And so part of what we look at is you have the option to recommend to do parts of those. Where we find is you gain from economies of scale. So it's cheaper per linear foot to replace all of the sidewalk than it is to do one block at a time. Same thing for lighting. If you make the recommendation to update the Sternberg lights alone, that only gets us as far as we then need to upgrade the power as well. If we're going to rip up the sidewalk, then you do it for the other pieces at the same time. I will say that Virginia Street right now, it ranked very high based off of being listed in so many plans, and we know the importance of it. The infrastructure is not at a failure state to our knowledge right now. However, it is very limiting in our ability to expand and do further things on Virginia Street. A great example is we have a lot of special events downtown, and they would love to be able to string lights across the Sternberg lights. Those are non-weight bearing, and they are actually, some of our traffic signals are actually rusting at the bottom based off of the design when they were installed in the 90s. A lot of them don't even have high enough depth for public safety vehicles to get underneath of them, even if we could string up costs. So while they're not in a failure state, it is lacking in our ability to expand. We don't have the power infrastructure to be able to put up twinkle lights and Christmas lights downtown. That's Rachel every year works on this, trying to find a path. So I don't know that that specifically answers, but that's one of the things that we're looking at is, and things rank a bit higher, knowing if they're at that failure rate or if we have more plans. The river is a great example. There is no dedicated funding source for the river. There's not one person in charge of the river. And so we do have one window with the RDA funds there.
Mike Van Houten
Thank
for
you.
the record. I have a couple of comments just on the priorities of these projects. For me, just personally, you mentioned in our briefing that there were different levels of lighting that were possible at the event center and Bowling Stadium. The $800,000 option would be like the total bells and whistles, color changing type lights, and then there was a cheaper option just to kind of light it up with like floodlights. That was cheaper. I would prefer to do the cheaper option on the event center and bowling stadium lighting, especially since the event center is only used like 5 or 6 times a year, and put that money towards the Lear Theater, at least possibly re-roofing it so that it doesn't sustain any more damage until we can kind of figure out what to do with it. Or for kind of like we discussed in the briefing, triaging Virginia Street, maybe on a block by block basis and seeing if maybe a couple of blocks could be done on Virginia Street, or fixing the irrigation, or just kind of studying that more. But if the Lear Theater is truly kind of in jeopardy of getting further damage, especially in the coming winter, next winter, I would like to de-emphasize the event center and bowling stadium lighting um, and put it towards that. And I'm a big fan of the rail depot improvements and getting that to the point where it could be leased. Because I did look at Alicia Barber's newsletter, and what they did in New Orleans was amazing. And then in RDA 2, I walked around the University Village area before this meeting, and I didn't think that the sidewalks were really that bad. There were a couple of areas that needed to be patched, but there was entire blocks that were okay, like along Lake Street between I think it was 6th and 7th, or 7th and 8th streets. I can't remember exactly. But I would like to, when I had my sidewalks done on my street, I was assessed that as a property owner, and I don't know if that money could come from a street rehabilitation fund or actually assess the university, but I was a little bit disappointed that they haven't even painted those houses yet. So I kind of felt like doing the sidewalks was maybe premature, and putting that money towards the phase 3 design of the river path. So that way, this year, both the phase 2 and the phase 3 designs could be done. So next year, they could be constructed. And you mentioned in our briefing that that would basically, by the end of next year, it would be under construction or completed from Lake Street all the way down to GSR. And I think the river is such a community asset that it would benefit way more people than just kind of the limited scope of the University Village area, which, nothing against the people who are living there who work for the university, but that really only limits a very small piece of that. And I feel like that kind of infrastructure improvement could be contributed to from the university. And I love the bistro lighting. I think they have invested so much private money into East 4th Street. There's so many different projects there, from the AO Works to the Morris to the Prince Soft Lofts to the 900 East 4th Street project that's now getting underway, that I feel like contributing bistro lights to that district would be kind of the icing on the cake for them. So those are my thoughts. And just one question does the bistro lighting just include the poles or also the lighting as well? And is that like wind friendly?
Yeah, Brian McCardle for the record, it would include improvements for the footings, the poles, and the lighting. I imagine the maintenance needs would be matched by the current maintenance needs of what each Sternberg takes down there. It might be less even based on the Sternbergs, but I imagine the maintenance would be similar. So we would cover all the improvements and then hand it over to streets.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, those would be my recommendations is, lower the cost of the event center bowling stadium lighting and put that towards the Lear, and then and RDA 2, put off doing the University Village pedestrian improvements until they invest some money into that district as well, even if it's, we do it the year after. And I would love to see the river path completed from Lake Street to GSR within the next couple of years.
So just to keep us organized here with what's the best way to organize some of these suggestions so that we can make a motion to approve this, then approve the budget, and then go up to RDA. So for example, if we start to pull pieces out of here, there, what's the best way for you all to track that?
So I would say, Ashley, Attorney Assistant City Manager for the record, the easiest way at the end, what your motion prevails is what we will take. What I would actually probably tell you to go in reverse order and start with RDA 2, because I think that you have a little bit more wiggle room there, because you have a few options. You can either move forward with what the committee recommended. If you want to start part and parceling, you can do that. As Brian mentioned, if you want to go deeper into your reserves, you can. You also do not have to spend all of the budget this year that's here. You have an option to just put forward your recommendation and tell us to keep the money in the bank. We're earning interest on it. And this will allow you to do larger projects in the future. So you don't have an obligation to expend all of those funds. That only half answers your question, but I felt like those were important parts to kind of note.
No, I think that's, so let's start with RDA 2. So taking member Van Houten's comments, he would like to pull a little bit of the money from item number 1 and try and refocus it down, or try and get us into River Path Phase 3 into this budget. So I guess my question would be, if we move to recommend River Phase 1 construction, obviously a substantial project, that I assume that would take us in, by the time we get into the next operating budget, that project will still be going. So then we could take a look and then move into Phase 3 at that time.
You can, yes. What we would recommend at a minimum on your cadence, that you are designing the next phase while you're building the previous one.
Okay.
So right now we are under design for Phase 1. So that's why we're recommending that you construct Phase 1, design Phase 2. And then in theory, next year, we would come back and say, construct Phase 2, design Phase 3. Okay. If you'd like to move forward, as Member Van Houten suggested, of doing design for Phase 2 and 3 this year, design is about $600,000. Each segment is about $6 million. So that is one option of your 1.5. You could take half of that for your next phase of design, and then you could decide to shelve the university item for this year and then reevaluate it next year. Could be one option based off of what he's recommended today.
Okay.
Are there any cost savings or efficiencies in doing Phase 2 and Phase 3 design together? Do the designs become stale after time, or does it hurt?
I imagine, Brian McCardle again, I imagine there would be some economies of scale and scope by combining both of them. If you combine Phase 2 and 3 design, that would just be essentially one phase, just a bigger portion. And then in future, you could do Phase 2 and 3 construction as one project. Rather than space it out over 2 years, you could do it one. it would just be dependent if we have
Just do
funds.
the motion and then do the one construction and design two and design three at the same time
Yeah.
and do the parks.
But I was leaning the same as Commissioner Kenny, just designing 2 and 3
Two and
together
three,
at one
yep.
time.
And then,
Even
yeah,
if we got to pull.
Did you just design this?
yes, no problem. I'll let my kids run around down there and get a good idea.
That's my thoughts.
Can you put that into a recommendation?
Sure. Jay Kenny for the record, looking at what we have here, I'd recommend that we would move on with number 2, River Phase 1 construction, and then also go into number 3, River Phase Design number 2, but also add in River Phase Design 3 at the same time, moving all that forward, and also approve the play elements at Broadhead and John Champion's Parks.
Very good.
Question, well, I'll second the motion, but then I got a question.
Yeah.
The Delta, I saw that the University Village improvements actually has 2 different components. One of them 600,000, one's 848 or 828.
828.
There should be enough to do the 828. If you pull the 600 out for design, would your motion want to include that?
Yes, yes,
And would your motion include the bistro lighting?
no,
No bistro lighting.
no. Save some money.
Okay, so we have a revised motion. We got to go back and,
Nope,
Unless someone
Okay.
wants to
Nope,
like-
all right, so we have,
we're tracking. We just need to make sure that, and I think
Yeah.
your seconder is on board.
yeah, so the motion's on the table.
Is debating.
So Member Harris, for the record, the bistro lighting, I agree with, I think, Member Van Houten. The 4th Street District has spent a lot of personal funds on improvements that they could have asked for more money for. And so in my opinion, because they are bringing that forward and spending so much private money, I would like to see that bistro lighting included in Jay's provision.
Where does it run from?
Just trying to match.
Like
Geographically.
Yeah,
to
to see if they want
Sutro?
to-
Yeah, it would be in 2 sections because the rail line goes right through it. So it would go from Evans to right in front of the Union Pacific, right in front of the Union Pacific change. And then the second section from that to Lake Street. So if you look at it by business, it would go from Louis Bass Corner to the fire station right at the end of Valley Road.
Okay.
Include that.
Okay,
Does the math work out if we have
that's what
something back in?
I'm trying to add everything up.
You've got math.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got money
I got it.
because when we got updated numbers from our finance department, and so we're actually anticipating if you were to take 4 million from your reserves, we've got about 11 million
Okay.
versus we thought it was gonna be
Okay.
10 and a half-ish,
So
so.
if your motion's taking 6 from the University Village improvements and allocating that 6 to River Path
Correct.
Phase 3.
Then we have enough.
Design. And
Yeah.
that's good with the.
I'm good with it. Yes, bistro lighting is back in.
Second as amended.
Okay. Okay, let's, any other comments before we vote?
Colin.
Okay, Colin, what say you?
I just had a question with regard to the play elements at Broadhead and John Champion Parks, because I absolutely recognize the need, but there were separate proposals under RDA 2 for redesign, master plan redesigns for both parks. So I just am wondering if it's the best use of the resources to throw $300,000 at play elements if there is a need for a complete redesign of the 2 parks to the tune of $4 million total.
Brian McCardle, I can sort of answer that. I mean, it's about $1 million per play structure. So I imagine that these play elements are smaller tactical improvements to those parks that could come into place before the entire redesign and reinvestment of those parks. This is requested by the Parks and Rec department. So I can't add much more than that, other than I imagine these are smaller improvements.
So these, Ashley Attorney Assistant City Manager for the record, my understanding is that these are not traditional large play structures, as Brian mentioned, those are about $1 million a piece. These are more, you see the fitness equipment and smaller elements You as a body absolutely have the option if you would like to hold until those redesigns are done. That's perfectly within your right for recommendation as well.
Well, Nettie Oliveria, for the record, there are a number of families in that area, children that would hugely benefit from having anything.
We are seeing quite a bit more residential along the river as aligns with the retrap plan and direction we've gotten from the body. So we do know that those neighborhoods are starting to utilize those parks as more neighborhood pocket parks. So the use is certainly changing. And I think that's part of why Parks was asking for some supplemental materials in order to help change the uses in those parks specifically.
And do we know when possibly those would even be touched? So, I mean, is it?
So these funds become available July 1.
No, I'm saying on the redesign, what Colin was saying, like, do we have any future? We have none. So I would rather at least see something there for kids and adults to work together and do something and be active than have nothing.
Yeah, there's no dedicated funds from general fund or anything else at this time for those parks redesigns.
Any other comments? Anything else in the room? Okay, there's a motion on the table. It's been seconded. We've heard comment. All those in favor on this specific RDA2 recommendation, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, so we have our RDA2 recommendation filled out. Let's go up to RDA1. Nice job, Jay.
So, Mr. Chair, if I could, the committee felt it was important, as I mentioned, to put that Virginia Street option on there for you for consideration. We do know that there are fewer funds. This is, again, within your right. You could tell us that you don't want us to spend any money this year and you'd like us to just save all that CIP for next year. You do have a little bit more money if you want to go deeper into the reserves. We're recommending just taking 2 million of that 3 at this time. To give you kind of a starting point. You do have the option, as you did on your last one, you can look at these to say, yes, we certainly want these ones. And then that gives you some wiggle room money wise to incorporate other items.
I asked a Vets question real quick.
Yes.
Jay Kenny, for the record. In my opinion, I believe that the shade would obviously help with vets.
Significantly.
Significantly.
Yeah, both with events and organic activation of the plaza. So as we look at activating our vacant and underutilized spaces, both storefronts and public parks and plazas, tackling City Plaza will have completed what we've identified as our priority plazas downtown for activation. So food trucks, events, and just families coming back down on a Saturday to grab a cup of coffee.
Member Harris, just for comment, the downtown wayfinding signage, as we are moving forward with a rebrand, I think the wayfinding signage is a good use of our funds to start showcasing who we are and what we're doing through the rebrand process. So if we're going to make that continual, to me, that's an important piece.
Yeah, Mike Van Houten, for the record, I would agree with Member Harris that I think that if we do that wayfinding signage, we definitely would probably want to incorporate the branding of the redevelopment agency, possibly. And also with number 6, the rail depot, that would get it to the point where it would actually be a leasable space, right? So it'd be like HVAC, electricity, any plumbing items left?
For the record, we will see. It'll be either we get it to a space where it's leasable and we can just put it out for lease, or we get it to a spot where it's going to need additional TIs, depending on who's going to go in there. And so we could do an RFI or an RFP to find a partner to come in and make additional investments to get it to a usable space. We will see how far that funding gets us, but the intent is to get it fully activated.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's a follow-up question on that. Sorry, Mike, if you're not done, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
Follow-up question on that. Do you have any tenants identified? My concern is spending money on improvements that may not fit whatever tenant you want to get in there. Does it make more sense just to find the tenant first? And then whenever you're going in to make the improvements, no question, some improvements are gonna need to be made no matter what, but until you have identified the tenant, you might be wasting money that you're just gonna have to change later when you come in with TIs. Does it make more sense to hold off on those?
That would be something, I think we're gonna need to put money into that building, even if we go out and find a potential partner now. This would give us the budget to at least explore that. So I would say that we would entertain both options once we get this funding approved, figure out what it's going to take, what potential partners could come in. The original intent was we just need to get some basic things in there. HVAC, infrastructure, backflow preventers, and some.
Those are grease.
What do you need?
Grease
Utilities.
traps.
There's no grief.
There's no grease
So
trap.
no food.
But I agree with you. We don't want to do something that somebody else comes in and says, we want to reorient this whole thing, and then it's money wasted.
Right.
So we want to get it to a
Makes
point where you can
sense.
start entertaining those conversations. So I would say that we will explore, I think, all options.
Yeah, that would be my recommendation on 6, is at least explore before you start spending. You've got the money and maybe you can use that money as an ability to entice some folks in there. Like I got 650 in TIs right off the bat for you guys. But rather than having to rip stuff out later or modify it.
Yeah, it could be once we go in and start getting some architects to look at it, identifying what's needed. We could start entertaining partners, and then by the time we're having a budget discussion next year, if there's additional funds needed, we could have that discussion then.
And then I saw, even if you don't do number 1, you're still 80,000 over your 2 million.
We have $2,122,000
All right.
and like 41, 122,041.
I have a question for Mike, because I don't know this. Mike mentioned that the bowling stadium exterior lighting. So are we talking, so what are we trying to do there? Lighting up? I mean, is it like we're trying to do different color lights? Is this with the LED? Because Mike brought, no, let's save half that money and just put some normal lights out there, which I'm sure would just help dramatically. So what are they looking for?
So this request came from RSCVA. We're looking again where we can utilize for safety components. So that corner is actually quite dark at night. Next time you're in downtown, drive in, you'll be surprised that the city-owned infrastructure is probably the darkest corner in downtown. So the request ranges from $260,000 up to $800,000. And so this would be some uplighting on the exterior of the building. So that is like the safety flood lighting. The higher version goes up to LED color changing lights and something that we call cake lighting, as I keep looking back to the city engineer to make sure I've got it right. These are the lights that go around the exterior at the top. And as we mentioned earlier, as Brian mentioned, that we got confirmation from RSCVA this weekend, they have a line item in their CIP budget for $400,000 for this lighting. And so that could be an option of what we're looking for, is just that they came to us for the Delta. It wasn't presented that way to us in this application. So the ask in front of you would actually only be 400,000 instead of 800,000.
Okay.
So that might be a way to split the difference with some of Mike's options, but turning it back to the board.
Yeah, my comment is I'd want to do the full package on the lighting for the event center, knowing that we've got a 400 match from the RCVA.
Yeah.
So I'd want to leave that as is. The rest of them look fine. I'd kind of defer to them to decide what, if anything, they do with the delta that you'd have on the 2 million. Personally, the Lear Theater is not a priority for me. Great building, but the return on investment, I mean, it's kind of one of those sad things where it's going to take a ton to get it back up, and I don't know you're going to get the return on investment.
Well, Nadia Laverio, I will just say this is just to winterize it. To, to keep it from.
But personally, you start chasing good money for something that's, what are you going to get for it? It may be better used for some other purpose. I don't know. Personally, it doesn't make my top list here of something to spend on this cycle. Otherwise, I'm comfortable with this, knowing that we got a $400,000 match from the RCBA.
Mike Van Houten for the record. On number 6, are there other grants that could assist with that cost, like a SHPO grant or a CCCHB grant, or even maybe a Union Pacific Railroad Foundation grant? have those been looked at as also funding sources for the rail depot improvements?
Brian McCardle again. In my experience, a lot of those grants are in the $50,000 range.
Okay.
They're not substantial. Other states do have big funds to support historic preservation in the tunes of tens to $20 million when you see the capital stack come together. Typically in Nevada, you see $50,000 here and there, and I do believe some funding may have already gone to this building.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, it would be something that staff will continue looking through the options. And we work very closely with our arts and culture manager who oversees our historic preservation program. But at this time, we've not spent a lot of resources going down that path based off of it being kind of unleasable in its current state.
Gotcha. Okay.
One thing to note that we do send frequent memos to this board for awareness, but one of the things we discovered through this process is Dan Tressley, our project manager, found out that the electrical is actually not split on these two buildings. And so we don't have a way to charge the tenants and split out Amtrak's cost from whoever would live on the other side. So that's something that when we look at the 650, regardless of do you need sprinklers or not, depending on the use that would go in, that's like thing one that has to be sorted is splitting that electrical. And Dan's been working with an electrical engineer and contractors to try to find those options, but that's thing one.
Jay Kenny for the record again. Sorry, Mike, go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, no, you go ahead. I'll go after you.
I was just piggybacking here with Mike is that I would rather just see us offer some type of a TI because we can do all the work and it's going to be the wrong person, right? That's going to come in there. So I would rather see someone, hey, look, we'll offer you this, at least feed the carrot to someone and say, hey, we'd love you down here. Yep. This is what we're willing to do for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Mike Van Houten, for the record, I kind of agree with that to a point. I think part of the reason so many downtown retail spots are empty is because of the cost of the tenant improvements, and the building owners aren't willing to do that. So if we can fix this up to a certain point and just do generic things like electrical, HVAC, things like that, the restrooms, which were already budgeted, I think it would be a much more attractive spot. And you just kind of think about that neighborhood and what it is right now, Reno Revival, it is just crawling forward. So you basically just have the men's club right there. And that's the whole activation for, a couple of square blocks around it. And so I think that I'm all for that. If just a question for the board. So if we go with the 400,000 for the event center and Bowling Stadium exterior lighting, if they're going to match that at the RSCBA, which makes me really happy because I didn't know that in the briefing when we had chatted. I was a little upset that they weren't going to contribute anything to that. Would we want to just keep the extra 400,000 in reserves, or were there other projects on that list of the 50 or 60 projects that you might want to fill that would fit that $400,000 budget?
Yeah. Well, let me just throw this out there. The Virginia Street sidewalk improvements did score the highest in the matrix. Obviously, the price tag is substantial. What would be the appetite of the board to at least allocate an equivalent of what we're allocating in RDA2 for pedestrian improvements up at the university, say $1 million around that? I mean, is it possible to say we'd like to see some Virginia Street sidewalk improvements? We've allocated $1 million. We have $400,000 that we can pull up to that and potentially go in to reserves. Is there any appetite to potentially put some money there? I don't even know if it's enough money to accomplish something, but at least so we're addressing the highest scoring item in the matrix.
Yeah. Mike Van Houten, for the record, I would agree with that. That's what kind of was what, I had talked with Ashley in our briefing about possibly using some of that money from the event center bowling stadium to somehow triage Virginia Street and figure out maybe what blocks are the most critical. Maybe there's certain blocks that are worse than others, and it was all just kind of lumped into this $20 million without really knowing what the conditions of each of the blocks are, whether it's the irrigation or the electrical. If some of that money could be used to study or come up with like a report on exactly
An area that's
what,
best.
yeah, what needs to be fixed, I'd be totally for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of my thought, whatever that savings is, just goes up to number one. And
Just the savings, or should we allocate some?
for me, just the savings and have staff, if they were to come back and look for some augmentation, say, hey, we've identified a project, it's gonna be 800. Can you pull another 400 from the reserves, rather than just say, here's $1 million from the reserve?
Okay.
Deplete the reserves, not knowing exactly where it's going. If that works for staff.
Yes, I would say Ashley Attorney, Assistant City Manager for the record. That's helpful direction for us. And so what we would do is take that allocation and then do kind of a block by block analysis and do this triage of identifying which trees are close to death's door, how much would just irrigation be, and then we could bring you back kind of a triage report as well as more of that part and parcel cost in a more substantial breakdown. But that 400 gives us at least a starting point to where we can dedicate some understanding. I think that shows that you're making some improvements and some public gesture towards the number one ranked item, without dipping further into your reserves, without knowing where that allocation might best be.
Okay, who wants to make a motion to kind of summarize the RDA 1 recommendation?
Well, and Nettie Oliverio, just before we do that, I just want to point out that if the city does not do anything to help the Lear withstand the winter, this is contributing to blight. And this is not our charge to contribute to blight.
Can we address the Lear? Any comments from you all, what you think?
I mean, can we get a cost, Mike Van Houten for the record, to at least see how much it would cost to possibly winterize it so it doesn't get to the point where it ends up having to be demolished? Could some of that money be used to at least get like because I know that there was I think was it 1.5 million to do like exterior improvements, landscaping, fencing, and roofing, but maybe if there's a way to cost out just the roofing part, because history is really important to me, and I know it might not seem like the best investment, but losing that building I think is a worse investment, and it just looks horrible.
Especially by neglect.
Yeah, by neglect.
Ashley Attorney, Assistant City Manager for the record. A few things to note based off of the Historic Structures Report, HSR, not HRC. There were 3 proposals that came in through that process. It's approximately $600,000 to stabilize the Lears, the terminology used in the report. I would be remiss if I did not mention, though, that not all of those would be eligible for RDA money because many of them are just basic repairs or deferred maintenance. For example, a roof is a capital improvement. That would be something that would be eligible. Fixing broken windows, dealing with the vegetation that's coming in through some of the exterior, that is maintenance or repairs in which RDA funds would not be eligible. So baseline is 600,000, and that is just basic stabilization to get the areas that see sunshine to not see sunshine. The improvements that were recommended for the exterior were at about $1.6 million is estimated at this time based off the continuing cost of construction. Again, not all of those would be eligible for RDA. A fence is eligible, landscaping is eligible, concrete repair is not, for example. The next stages from there go up to 15 million and 22 million based off of turning it into something that would be operatable. But again, that's just opening the doors. I don't know if that's helpful and answered the question, but that's kind of your phased approach.
Thank you.
What do you think?
Okay, I'll try a motion. I would move to approve the RDA recommendation as presented by staff with the revisions of 1, the RCVA match of 400,000 on the event center, allocating that difference to Virginia Street sidewalk improvements as a line item for staff to evaluate and bring back recommendations. And with the comment on the rail depot improvements of evaluating, holding that out as a TI carrot for folks if that is more beneficial.
I'll second that.
Second. Any comments? I'll take some comments online too, if anybody's online.
For number 6, Mike Van Houten for the record, to Michael Pawnee's comment, what exactly do you mean like pulling it out as a carrot? So you don't want to do like the HVAC improvements and the electrical and things like that? Because I think those have to be done no matter what that use is going to be.
The intention of the motion is that staff explore the ability to have that money available for TI improvements for a tenant. And if there's no tenant that's available, then they can proceed with those improvements as identified. But a tenant may have different ideas for HVAC or different demands for HVAC than what's proposed in that number. So for me, it's let's just go to the market and say we've got 650 available for improvements. Do you want to lease it? Great. Then we've got that as a TI incentive.
Gotcha.
If not, then staff got the flexibility to proceed.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So reserving it then at least for that
Yeah.
okay, gotcha.
Yes, correct.
If we, Brian McCarter for the record, if we bring an RFI forward, and that's the path, we'll bring it before this body, before we release that RFI. So there'll be a decision point there. And then if we go in and realize that there are some improvements before we sign any contracts, assuming they're high enough, also come before this body. So this gets us to having those conversations in the future.
Did you get the money up for the pedestrian improvement study?
The Virginia Street, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Second, any other comments, questions? Okay, all those in favor of this RDA 1 recommendation, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, so we have our RDA 1 recommendation. Now we'll move up.
Can I, sorry, Mr. Fair, can I take us back to the motion, because we do need, you want to close out before just some additional motions?
The budget on it all?
Yeah.
I will add too, just as a general comment that I know there's been a lot of concern, studies, town halls over the Lear. And it is within our purview in certain regards. So I guess I would just keep it on our minds, I guess, to come back and continue to try and see how we can support not losing that historic project. And just essentially not just pass it away, but just keep it on our minds so that we can find maybe or participate in some solutions.
Understood.
I'll make this one.
Thank you.
So you're going. I would also move that the advisory board recommended the redevelopment agency approval of the proposed capital improvement plan, project prioritization framework, and associated budget, and further recommend that the redevelopment agency include projects as previously mentioned in our 2 motions.
Okay, motion by member Pawnee. Do I have a second? Second by member Kenny. Any comment? All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, B4 is approved. Let's go back up to B3 on budget. Now that we have our CIP figured out, well done to the board.
There's no comments. I can make the motion.
Okay,
I move that that the advisory board recommend to the redevelopment agency approval of the proposed fiscal year 2027 agency operating budget.
okay.
Second.
Second, motion by member Pawnee, seconded by member Harris. Any comments or questions on this item before we vote? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Okay, budget is approved.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we will, does anybody need a break? Just a couple more items. We're good to keep going. Okay, let's go into B5, which is just an overview on City of Reno code enforcement.
Good afternoon, Lance Parado, Director of Licensing and Code Enforcement, for the record. Here to talk to you a little bit about code enforcement today, just kind of give you an overview of the rules and authority of code enforcement and how it relates to RDA. So just a snapshot of the department, relatively small. And in fact, since I created this slideshow, we had another retirement and another promotion. So currently we are at 4 full-time code enforcement officers. We're looking to hire another 2 relatively soon. They don't become real code officers for about 6 months. So really, we're still going to be working with 4 for the next 6 months, give or take, until they can get off on their own and get their own cases. We have a couple of administrative folks, as well as a manager and a senior officer over those 4 code enforcement officers. Department overview here, long story short, the code enforcement department aims to maintain safe, clean, livable neighborhoods while addressing blight and responsible property maintenance. So a little deeper on that, we're focused on private property. We enforce on property maintenance, zoning violations, abandoned structures, junk vehicles, encampments, other nuisances. I'll dive a little deeper that in a second. Our authority comes under RMC 822 and IPMC. As you'll note, that's the 2012 IPMC. Generally speaking, it gets updated every 6 years. In 2018, it did not get updated. So we are bringing forward, I've already come forward to council once to get permission to go forward with that. And we're looking next month to bring that up to the 2024 standards. So you'll see that coming through. There's also a section on downtown property maintenance that's outside and above these standards. I'm not sure if that'll come back for review or at least for presentation to this body, but within the next month, I will be going forward with councils to present to council on the new updates. A little deeper on nuisances. There's a broad category of nuisance and definitions in RMC. There's about 30 or so definitions that go along with this. The primary ones: unsafe abandoned structures, could be boarded up, stalled construction, dangerous buildings, property neglect, is exactly what you think it is. Blight, broken windows, fencing, etc. Couple more examples of nuisance: hazardous conditions, debris infestation, polluted water, criminal or unlawful activity. So repeated disturbances at specific properties. And I think that's what a lot of people think of when they get to the downtown blighted areas. There might be more crime related, as we spoke of earlier. Code violations, specifically any code violation, but fire, building, property maintenance are big ones. Illegal parking comes into play a little bit outside of the parking enforcement department, but for division. And then other risks like abandoned shopping carts, unsafe areas attracting minors, excessive garage sales. That's also something.
Yeah.
So you only have 4 in a year.
You can stop him.
Can I ask a question?
About garage sales?
Yeah. Yes, I won't be having one.
You can have a couple.
Now, is there, when they banning shopping carts, is there a program that not through you guys that people are picking up shopping carts? I mean, is there like a business that does that or anything?
We have a consultant. We work with somebody that handles that for us. They're contracted.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
There could be people doing it outside of those areas, and not to my knowledge. But,
okay.
We do have a contracted business that goes and picks up carts and turns them in.
I got you. And then with the obviously with the RV parking of all over town, how is that going? I mean, I know you guys are just slammed.
Yeah, that's actually shifting more towards parking enforcement.
Okay.
The abandoned vehicles and they're now under PD.
Okay.
So code enforcement's not addressing that specifically. That's separate.
Okay.
Just some fun pictures of nuisances. These are the kind of things you can get calls for. So the enforcement process as it stands now, we want compliance first. We don't want to go after people and just hammer them with citations. It's not always the most effective. We start with a courtesy letter. Our standard process is 14 days later, we come back, you haven't fixed it, you get a warning of violation. 14 days after that, you get a citation. There are restrictions in NRS and RMC on how fast you can act on some of this stuff, especially if it's caused by criminal activity that's not your own. So we have to abide by those. We do charge reinspection fees when we go out. Ultimately, if we have something that's a danger to the health and safety of the community, we can't abate a nuisance. And basically, we'll cover the cost, and then we will lien the property. So if there's a structure that needs to come down, or that's generally how it would work. The structure will come down. The city would take care of that, and then we would lien the property and try to get the funds back that way. And that kind of leads into the notice to intent. We can lien on properties once our enforcement efforts have ended and we're not getting anywhere. We can lien the property. That has its benefits and its drawbacks, because once you lien the property, no more enforcement action takes place, and then we're just sitting on it and waiting until that property gets sold or someone dies, and to be able to get repaid. Currently, we are working on a new policy that should be published within the next day or two that will have some ideas about how we can go about this. And then specifically, council has raised concerns about the vacant abandoned buildings downtown and nuisance buildings downtown. We're adjusting policy to cite those more frequently. So there hopefully will be a more of a response when we're citing daily on these. And we're also looking into special assessments so that if those fees get too high, we could put them onto the property tax rules with Washington County. That's a process that we're working with the Washington County Treasurer's Office. So it's all moving parts, but we are trying to address the concerns of just having these buildings sit here and just leaning them or citing them every day and not getting any sort of response. We also handle the motel inspection program. There are 73 motels in the city. It's about 3,200 units. These are your 28-day plus stays. So for all intents and purposes, these are just, they're long-term rentals. We go and do inspections in each and every one of them, check for things like smoke alarms, window screens, unpermitted work, electrical, infestation. The whole purpose here is safe, sanitary, affordable living is what we're after. The program has been tweaked more recently. Now we're going on a more regular basis or a regimented basis, and we're going to be inspecting 100% of the rooms to make sure that everybody's living in adequate conditions.
That's a lot. So how often do you do that?
We're doing it annually.
So once a year you'll go.
Yeah, once a year. Yeah, and we're looking into making it more effective by, I don't want to say carrot stick, but similar on those lines, where if you're an A+ tenant or owner, then you get inspected less often, and maybe even less fees that go along with that. If you're a problem child, then you're going to see us all the time. So we're still working on those for the program to see what's most effective. We're still in the early stages of analyzing where that's going to go. Some stats for you. So we're complaint driven primarily. We do proactive cases, but we are the majority complaint driven. About 3,600 cases in FY25. Just a note for you, we do have a downtown dedicated officer that's dedicated to Ward 1 and RDA 1 specifically. So we can address those blight issues and those complaints a lot faster by having a dedicated person that's on top of it and sees those properties every day. Just a breakdown by ward here. Ward 1, your main RDA area. Ward 1 itself, 1,144. You can see that's by far above the most complaints. RDA 1, 306. RDA 2, 545. So other than Ward 1, everything's pretty well dispersed. South Reno gets less complaints, and Ward 3 is right there towards the top as well. So there's my contact information. If you ever have to submit a request, I've got a link on there for you, and then website that you can just kind of see the general information on how the process works. I'm happy to answer any questions now. You can call me later. You can email me anytime. But anything you've got right now, I'm happy to answer.
Any questions? Comments? Anything online?
Yeah, I got a question, Mike Van Houten for the record. I can't remember exactly what council meeting it was, but I remember the mayor mentioning that Las Vegas uses daily continuing violations without really any meaningful cap, so that each day the conditions exist is like a separate offense that accrues automatically, instead of treating it like individual compliance issues. Was there any, and since Las Vegas kind of follows the same law as Reno, was there any appetite to kind of look at how Las Vegas does that, to put a little bit more pressure on some of the downtown property owners?
Yeah, Lance Brotto for the record. The other jurisdictions do things very similar to what we do. They do have methods that they go after people in more aggressive ways. We've set our previous policy was to go after these, like I said, aim for compliance first. To go after these properties and to give them the opportunity. Obviously, once they've exhausted our goodwill or their opportunities to comply, then yes, there are certain circumstances when people have been fined more often than those 2 weeks. As I was saying, we're trying to adjust the policy to some of these properties to address these vacant commercial properties downtown that are abandoned and likely would go after them and cite them every day. There are downsides to doing that. Just hammering somebody $1,000 a day for a year it could be productive because somebody jumps in immediately and says, "I'll fix this. I'll stop. Please stop." They could also just say, like, "I don't have that money and I'm not paying it." So really, we're not gaining ground. So that's where the special assessment thoughts come in, and being able to say, like, well, you may have to pay this because it's going to be on your property taxes. We'll see if that's something that the city is able to do and want to go through it. But yes, we are looking into different ways that we can cite and we can gain compliance other than just leaning a property and saying, "Okay, we're done with you. Now it's not going to fix the problem, but you still owe us money." That's kind of counterproductive. So
Sure.
I'll also address in the memo that will be going to council soon. There are other methods that council could advocate at the legislature to change some of these provisions and to make things more aggressive or lower the limits to when we can act. So those will be talked about soon as well.
Awesome. And one follow-up question: if a lien is put on a property, and I just have to kind of forgive my ignorance here because I've never had a lien, thank goodness. Do they stay indefinitely on the property until it sells and then it has to be paid off, or do they fall off after a certain number of years?
Yeah, it'll hold on for forever, and it's whether it's
Gotcha.
sold or refinanced, it will stay there until that transaction occurs.
Okay, thanks.
Lance, thanks for being here. When do you go before the RDA to talk about potential legislation?
At this time, I don't have anything scheduled to go before them. I'm drafting a memo. It's with legal right now, and that memo will just kind of give them a heads up on where this process is at, because council's brought up multiple times that they want to see things addressed, and our current process doesn't work, is what the perception is. So I wanted to explain how the process works, give some suggestions, possible avenues that we could go. But you'll see that memo published on the website within the next couple of days.
Okay, yeah, I meant city council, not RDA.
Yeah.
That's what I was gonna weigh in on is, yes, so city council is the enforcement governing arm. As we know from Rory's presentation today, RDA has very narrow limits in which they can act. City staff will be bringing forward the legislative platform and opportunities for BDRs later in the summer. And so with Lance's memo going out, that will be something that they will have in consideration. I think that item comes forward to council in July as our BDRs are due in August. So that will be conversation for them later this summer.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. You got something else?
I would just say, Lance, thanks for all you do. You guys do a lot, and I don't think people realize how much you guys do. So please thank your staff.
Thanks. Yeah, no, they're a good team. They're small right now.
Yeah.
Growing, hopefully.
Small but mighty.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So
Biggest little committee.
try to get staff on and get them all trained up. Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Welcome.
Okay, we'll close that item. Before we move into our next item, I just wanted to mention to the board. So this B6 presentation overview of small walls is something that we need to hear today. But I would ask you all the next item, B8, which is very, very important, just a review of peer city advisory board structures and best practices for redevelopment agencies, that we potentially table that to the next meeting. Is that okay with everybody? Just in terms of time. Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll do that. We'll move B8 off. You're good with that, Mike?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay. So let's get into small walls, and then we're rounding third here.
Guys, Rachel McIntyre, placemaking manager for the record.
Oh, I don't know if you want to join me or not. You're welcome to.
I didn't hear anything other than I answered questions.
I'm
Are we gonna get those little hands? Okay.
This is called teamwork and collaboration across agencies, folks. So Rachel McIntyre, placemaking manager for the record, and then joined by Megan Berner, arts and culture manager of the city of Reno. Here today to present a discussion topic on Small Walls program, which is a new placemaking initiative that we are piloting in this fiscal year. Jump right in. Quick program overview. When we think about creative placemaking, we know that public art is a key element to that. Murals and sculptures are one of the what I'll call like low-hanging fruit tactics that we can use to go in and achieve some quick wins with creative placemaking. This specific program is supporting murals, facade sculptural art, and window treatments as a means to create a new program to get more public art into public spaces. Few things with Small Walls, it is intentionally designed as a Small Walls program. What that means for us is a mural that is 75 by 10 to up to 75 feet tall, 10 feet wide. And it requires that the artwork remain in place for up to 2 years after the mural or sculpture is put in. Our goals and alignment. So the Small Walls program advances both RDA and goals and the public art master plan goals. Again, using creative placemaking to help strengthen our downtown and our neighborhood districts. We're using creative placemaking to address corridor blight. We want to enhance walkability, improve the visual character of our neighborhoods, buildings, and properties. We want to activate blank storefronts and reduce blight using art. It's a really great way to brighten up a city amidst maybe a city and a street that has a lot of vacancy. We want to encourage more pedestrian activity and street level vibrancy. And really one thing that's exciting about this program is we want to reduce the barriers for small businesses and emerging entrepreneurs, both in the creative space by funding our arts, and also with our small businesses who are here in brick and mortars across RDA 1 and RDA 2, and maybe have a strong desire to make the exterior of their buildings a little bit brighter and shinier through public art, but don't necessarily have the means. Moving on. Funding structure. So where's the funding coming from? We are funding this program through the existing RDA budget that was approved by this body last year. We're offering a 50% match. Our RDA board has shared with us that a match program is what is most desirable when we're looking at funding public-private partnerships with public art or facade improvements or restore, any of those programs. And so we're taking a page from the restore book at a match. Grants are up to $10,000 per project. So what this could look like at a minimum is that we have 10 new murals or sculptures that are added to exterior facades across properties in RDA 1 and RDA 2 by the end of FY26, which is pretty exciting. FY27, which is pretty exciting. And that's at a minimum 10 new murals. Some of these projects may not cost $20,000, which could expand and allow for us to have even more murals or sculptural art that we're adding. It is a reimbursement grant. So what this means is that the property owner does need to pay for the mural and complete the work, then they can submit for reimbursement, similar to what we do with the Restore program. We are looking at 1 mural per building per funding round. We want to make sure that there's enough to go around. And with that, we want to be able to create more opportunity for more properties. In partnership with this, we are creating a city-approved artist list. Artists from all over are welcome to apply. That will be run by the Arts and Culture Department, and artists will be selected for this program through the city-approved list. Artwork cannot function as signage, can't include logos. This is intended to be public art that is both publicly and privately funded. Sculptural projects must meet the city permitting and building code requirements as well. Evaluation and timeline. So we'll do as we do with Restore. We will have a review committee for this process. We'll be working in tandem with Arts and Culture Department. Some of the key evaluation priorities, we're looking for visibility and public facing impact. We're looking for the activation of blank walls, alleys, and priority corridors. Artistic strength and local relevance, feasibility, permitting readiness, and maintenance plans. We are set to open this tomorrow. Really excited about. And project work must begin within 60 days of the award. Completion is required within 100 days. Okay. What questions do you have?
Any questions, comments? Anything online?
Mike Van Houten for the record. I think it's a cool program. I'm excited about it. I think it kind of bridges the gap for large art versus no art, and I'm excited about this.
Yeah, agreed. Love this program. Okay,
Thank you.
thank you so much. Okay, that takes us through our business items. We tabled item C. We'll hear from the DRP next time. Any item D, any announcements, member reports, anything for the good of the order? E, any future agenda items? So we know we'll have the community survey come up. The other thing I would just mention to my peers here is that B8, the review of Pierce City Advisory Board structures and best practices, that some of that work, as you know, has already been done. It's in the packet. If you want to just take some time to review that so that we can have a robust discussion on that next time, that would be good. There's a lot of other examples here linked, way they're funded, board structure, how many staff they have. And it just will help give us a good discussion if you are able to review some of that stuff before. Any other agenda items? Okay, any public comment? Anything online? Okay,
Nope.
I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
And motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
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 Okay, we are adjourned.
All right. Good work.
Good job. Yeah, well done, all you
Thank
guys.
you to the board. I know this was a very lengthy meeting and it's a sign of a very active